Welcome to Mission Possible on the Talking Information Center. My name is John Shea, and today we have a very special guest joining us. He is a professor at Harvard Business School. He's on the board of the Massachusetts Association of the Blind and Visually Impaired, and he's also the host of a podcast series called Dangerous Vision. His name is Randy Cohen. Randy, good afternoon. How you doing today?
I'm great. It's great to be here with you.
My pleasure. So I gave a quick introduction of some of your titles, but give a full introduction as to who exactly you are and what Dangerous Vision is all about.
So I've been teaching at Harvard Business School for the last 25 years with a brief sojourn over to MIT Sloan. I teach finance and entrepreneurship, and I love it. I teach mostly MBA students, but also students from all across the university and nearby universities. In addition to that, I suffer from retinitis pigmentosa. So basically, it kind of gets a little worse every year. I'm in my 50s now, and it's pretty, my eyesight's quite limited, but I can still see a tiny bit, and a tiny bit is a lot better than zero, so I feel fortunate in that regard, and also fortunate just for all the help and support I get from everybody around me at the university, Massachusetts Association. The name of this state is too long. MAVVI, as we call it, Mass Association for the Blind and Visually Impaired. I worked with the folks at MAVVI to create the Dangerous Vision podcast. My little joke is that, whenever you see a person in a movie who's blind, they'll always do something using their magical blind guy sense, like grab a canapé off of a passing tray or something. And you're like, how did they do that? And of course, the answer is there is no magical blind guy sense. But what there is that 90% of blind people have a tiny bit of sight like I do. And so every once in a while, we can do something that seems pretty normal. And then at other times, we really can't tell what's going on. And so the terms for this are things like low vision or partially sighted or legally blind. They all seem a little negative and unsexy to me. I wanted the sexier thing. So I said, I've got dangerous vision. I have just enough vision to be dangerous. And so that's how the name came about for the Dangerous Vision podcast. Also a glancing reference to the classic Harlan Ellison science fiction, speculative fiction collection, I should say, Dangerous Visions. And anyway, so we interview interesting people who have some relevance to blindness or vision impairment, but real emphasis on the interesting. Like, we just want to talk to fascinating people all the time and have great conversations. And sometimes we talk about blindness, but, sometimes that's only 5% of the conversation, even if the person is in fact totally blind. So for example, we interviewed the world's best sleight of hand magician is totally blind, and absolutely amazing to talk to him and about the things he can do. And of course, to see him on stage doing his routine. So mostly we talked about stage magic and his incredible life. But of course, we talked a little bit about blindness.
Very cool. I want to take a step back, Randy, and talk about your involvement with the Mass Association of the Blind and Visually Impaired. You're on their board. How did you get involved with what they do?
I guess it was through my good friend Alan, who was a board member and was very dedicated to the organization, also has RP. And Alan started talking to the folks who run the organization. And what they were seeing at MAVVI was the biggest opportunity to make a difference in the lives of blind people in the short run revolved around technology. Obviously, in some sense, everything we do has technological elements. And of course, curing and treating blindness or preventing it are huge things. And there's technology involved with that too. But that stuff is further in the future. As excited as I am about the therapies under development, nobody expects anything to happen in the next 12 months to treat me and treat my blindness. But what is happening is every day, apps are being created for the phone, physical devices are being created, things that make a big difference in my life and in the lives of millions and millions of blind people. And that's one of the topics we talk about the most on Dangerous Vision. And then I teach this class here at HBS, which is an entrepreneurship class for startup businesses, where I help the students grow their business and get funded and so forth. And Alan, I think, felt that I could be helpful at MAVVI as a sort of connector between the world of blind folks and those who try to help them, who really need exciting new technologies, and then the world of people who either create those ideas or fund them. I think that's where they hope that I could contribute.
Amazing. So you're a professor, you're involved with MAVVI. What led you into the world of podcasting?
I just love to talk. With podcasting, it's all about voice and listening. So it's a good fit for blindness. It's a good fit for blind audiences, right? So people who are blind can, enjoy the podcast 100%. They're not missing any element of what we're delivering. So it's a great fit in that regard. And I love interviewing people. And it's something I'm getting to do more and more of in my class, because I will have guest speakers come to class, including some really amazing people like Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank has been a great friend to the class and comes every year. And more I'm saying to those folks, let's do a fireside chat where I kind of interview you and ask you a question. Now, you don't have to do that with Kevin. Kevin is, he's got the whole thing under control. He's amazing. But a lot of people may have a great story to tell, but they may be a little shy about telling it, and I can help tease it out of them. And so I started doing that in the classroom, and I enjoyed it hugely. And I thought, boy, I'd love to do it for a bigger audience, and especially for an audience of folks who, share some of the challenges that I'm working with. So yeah.
So talk about that transition from being in front of a classroom full of students, you're interviewing a guest, you can kind of feed off the energy of your students, to just being in a studio by yourself, either with the other person with you or the other person joining you virtually. How did that transition happen with you from having an audience to not having an audience?
That's right. And of course, this has been a time where a lot of people have had that transition because of course, the change to doing speeches and meetings and stuff on Zoom. And so you're used to, you say something and you get some chuckles from the other people or whatever. And now, if you're presenting to a large room, they put everybody on mute so that it's not too distracting. But then, especially if you can't see, maybe if you can see if people are at least smiling. But for me, I'm not getting that feedback. It is a little tricky not having the audience. We did do one great live podcast where I interviewed Wick Grosbeck, who is the owner of the Boston Celtics. He was amazing, and Wick is a great philanthropist in terms of blindness. So, I joke that he's, he and I share a common interest in the 3Bs, business, blindness, and basketball. And we had a blast. And that one we did in front of an audience, and I do think it was the best one ever. So maybe someday if the podcast gets a wide enough listenership, we can do more live pods, which would be great. But what happened for me, was the head of advancement at the Mass Association for the Blind, David Brown, is a well-known figure here in Boston. He was the meteorologist on television, like the most watched news show for many years. And so he was really connected in media and loved media and encouraged me to push my work in that direction and try to reach that broader audience. And there definitely is sort of a little bit of a feeling sometimes with podcasting of kind of speaking out into the void. But, when you're interviewing somebody, it's certainly a lot better. I've never tried to do a podcast where I just talk. I think that would feel very strange to me to just talk with no audience, even knowing that theoretically people are going to be listening. It's tricky.
And we chatted with Randy Cohen on Mission Possible today. His podcast is Dangerous Vision. Randy, before we get too much further, share with us your contact information and where people can find your podcast, Dangerous Vision.
Yeah, so Dangerous Vision is on all the major platforms. It's on the in the iTunes store and Apple Podcasts, but it's also on Stitcher. I don't even know the names of all the different platforms, but I think it's up on all those. Honestly, if you're on your phone, just go to your podcast app and it will be there. It's Dangerous Vision with Randy Cohen. I don't think there's any other Dangerous Vision, but if there is one, then mine's the one that says with Randy Cohen. And if you're on a computer, probably the quickest thing is just to type Dangerous Vision with Randy Cohen into Google, and it'll pop right up. And it might start you at the most popular episode rather than the first episode, but that may not be a bad intro anyway. It's not really a narrative where you have to start at the beginning. So no worries there. With COVID, we really had to take a break for a while because, in theory, podcasting would be a medium where you could keep going, remotely with COVID. But the problem is that there were a bunch of tech aspects and I couldn't do them alone because I'm going to use the blindness as an excuse. I mean, the fact is there are blind people who do all kinds of amazing technological things. So, I'm just not as good as they are. So just say I personally couldn't do it alone. And so there needed to be more getting together of people. And obviously people were very careful about that for a while. So we kind of stopped. And then David got a huge promotion, who was a producer, got a huge promotion to a new job where he's running a major foundation, which I'm really proud of him. And it's fantastic. And so now we're lining up new production plans and all that. And hopefully we'll start recording season 3 soon.
Fantastic. So walk us through, let's start with season 1. Walk us through season 1. What was that like? That was your first season, your first time really doing the one-on-one interview series with the podcast. Walk us through what that season was like for you.
I would say I underestimated the technical challenges. It turned out that that's a real issue. And in fact, we had a couple of early podcasts that I thought were terrific interviews that we kind of had to throw away because the sound quality just wasn't high enough. Zoom wasn't really a thing yet. So we were just doing them over a pure telephone call, and that's not great sound quality. And of course, just, depending on the cell phone connection and everything else. So that was a real shame. So other than having to waste a couple, or maybe someday we'll release them as like special episodes for those who are not too sensitive to sound quality, but we certainly didn't want to start off the podcast with episodes that people had trouble hearing. Beyond that, I would say, look, it's humbling. You start off, you're trying to interview people. You've never done it before. You learn a lot. You learn that you probably need to prepare more than you thought you did. Keeping the conversation flowing in the right way and all is there's some challenges, but I would say I enjoyed it from the very beginning. There was never an episode where I was like, oh, why am I doing this? I always loved the people I was meeting and loved the conversations I was having. And so I felt really fortunate. We did a bunch of early episodes where we interviewed people associated with some of the big blindness organizations. And that was partly in the notion that we wanted them to share that with their membership. And we hope to use that as a mechanism for kind of getting the word out about what we were doing. But at the same time, it's not like the main thing we do on the pod is talk to people who run blindness organizations. I would say, the biggest group of people we interview are people who are fascinating, remarkable people who just happen to be blind. And then sometimes we talk to people who are really embedded in the blindness world, like the folks who run those organizations, and they're great too. And then sometimes we talk to people who are, connected to blindness. And so, for example, we did a wonderful episode with Peter Segal, who many of you may know from the NPR radio show, Wait, Don't Tell Me. And, if you want to have a great podcast episode, man, interview a radio professional. They got the skills. I mean, he just had so many great stories to tell. And the thing is, he's not blind, but he leads blind runners in the Boston Marathon and other marathons. And so he had a great, kind of heartfelt connection to the community, as well as just being a brilliant guy and a brilliant interview.
So what was the biggest lesson that you learned about producing an episodic podcast? What I would say is that there is a decision to make, which is, do you want to have a free-flowing, rambling conversation that comes to a natural conclusion at a certain point? In which case, if you're me and you have the kind of wide interest I have, you're going to end up with a lot of podcast episodes that are about 100 minutes long, more than an hour and a half. Or do you want to say, we're going to have a tight 40-minute podcast that people can, listen to on their morning commute and be done with? And there is a lot of sort of wisdom out there in the podcast world that says it's got to be tight. It's got to be it doesn't necessarily have to end at the exact same amount of time to the minute the way a sitcom episode does, but you got to be pretty disciplined about that. And I would say I have not learned that skill yet. And so given that I can't do a good job that way, like what I find is I spend 15 minutes asking the kind of basic questions that you need to tee up the rest of the conversation and also loosen up the guests. And then you get into the fun stuff where you're really getting the more wild stories and all this sort of thing. Essentially, choice one, learn this skill of disciplined, time-bound interviewing. I haven't done it. Okay, choice two, post long, rambling 100-minute podcasts. Choice three, edit the long, rambling 100-minute podcast down to a shorter episode that's 45 minutes or an hour long. My lean is towards number two. And partly that's because I listen to all podcasts at double speed. Now, I'm a pretty fast talker. And so when I listen to my own podcast after we record it, I admit at double speed, it's pretty fast. But it's become very natural for me to listen to things at double speed. And so for me, it's like, well, you're telling me it's a 100-minute podcast, but it's really only a 50-minute podcast. It's fine. And I just feel like the completeness of the conversation, the way connections get made across different parts of it, I hate to give that up. But I also understand that other people say, look, don't be an idiot, Randy. Nobody's going to listen to your endless podcast. You either need to tighten up or you need to be edited. And we did edit them down. And David did the editing. So I would say that to me is the big lesson learned is that you do have to face these hard choices. And I guess for season 3, I'm going to try to be more disciplined and see if I can, get a deal with the editor. If I can be disciplined and focused, maybe we don't have to do too much editing. I want to go back for a moment. You were talking about some of your favorite moments over the last couple of years. Could you share with us a few of your favorite interview moments throughout season 1 and season 2?
One that's jumping to mind is with Cyrus Habib, who was the lieutenant governor of the state of Washington. It was really a fascinating situation. He's been written up in a number of places. People may have read about him. The New York Times and others did pieces on him because he went to Columbia University. He's totally blind. Grew up, I guess, around Seattle, came to Columbia, returned to his home state, got involved in politics, decided to run for office. The governor of the state, Jay Inslee, was much discussed as a possible cabinet minister if Biden were to win the election. This was before the election that we did the interview, that Inslee might be Secretary of the Interior or Secretary of Energy or something. And that would have made Cyrus governor of Washington, which is really extraordinary. I mean, he's in his 30s. And so to be governor that young is amazing. And to be the governor that young when you're blind is double amazing. And but the reason he had all this coverage was that he had decided to leave politics and become a Jesuit priest. You know, entering the priesthood, and especially among the Jesuits, means years of training and lots of kind of sweeping floors and doing other things to, you know, make sure you're properly humble and all this. And so, you know, to go from this very exalted office to back, you know, down to the bottom and then to, you know, become a priest, sort of a servant of the people through their religious thing, you know, it's a remarkable change. And as I'm talking to him, it was not only heading into the election, but also the COVID crisis was going on. And also, you may recall, in the Pacific Northwest, there were lots of protests going on around George Floyd, and some of them were leading to, you know, there were fires and there were, you know, clashes with police and all this stuff. And so we're having this conversation, and we just hit it off. He had been a college debater of the same type that I was. And so we just kind of thought in a similar way. And we're talking, and literally his phone is just blowing up. You can hear it in the background because his chief of staff and others are like, you have to stop doing this interview and go deal with the fact that, you know, Seattle's burning or whatever the heck was going on. And he's having a great time talking to me. I'm having a great time talking to him. And, you know, so that was really pretty fantastic. Another favorite, because he's become a good friend, is Dan Berlin. Dan ran the world's largest vanilla company despite his blindness. And that is a fascinating business. Almost all the world's vanilla comes from Madagascar. And so, you know, you're constantly, you know, traveling to and dealing with conditions in Southeast Africa. And so much interesting stuff to talk about there and the economics of that business. And then, you know, Dan he runs marathons, and he does this rim to rim to rim at the Grand Canyon where you run down the wall and across and up, and he has to do it all tethered to somebody else who's sighted. And it's just so absolutely amazing. And I was kidding with him, and I'm like, well, it's pretty impressive that you did the rim to rim to rim. But, you know, I just want you to know, the other night, I got out of bed, walked downstairs, and put a couple pieces of toast in the toaster, made myself a peanut butter sandwich, and ate it. So, you know, we all have our accomplishments to be proud of. You know, it was just we really hit it off. I'm a huge fan of his. So I don't know. It's just been one great person after another. Really cool.
So about to begin season 3, once you have a new producer lined up. How did your interview techniques evolve from season 1 into season 2, and what will come in season 3?
Well, I warn people when they come on, I say, this is more like a conversation than an interview, which is code for you should expect me to do half the talking. Like I'm not just going to do the kind of interview where I ask a short question and then you give a long answer and then I ask another short question. I probably should do that. I'd probably be a better interviewer if I did that, but you kind of have to be who you are. And who I am is I've got lots of things I want to say also. And so, so what I'd say is, I do work on making sure that I don't overdo it and take too much of the guests' airtime, because obviously the audience wants to hear a lot from these guests, and I want to hear a lot from these guests, but I won't push it too far the other way either, to where my voice is not a big part of it. I mean, I absolutely believe that the world's best interviewers are not people who go on long rambling monologues like I do, so I recognize that mine is what economists would call a second best solution. You know, there's the best solution for the world, and there's the best solution given who I am, and continue to be talking.
What is your most favorite question to ask your guests?
You know, I have a few questions that I generally ask them at the end. I try to give them a heads up at the beginning that these questions will come up. So one question I really like to ask people is for their best story, because what I found is almost everybody has probably, you know, quite a bit more than one, but at least one truly amazing story. The story, if somebody said to them, look, 3 hours from now, you have to stand up in front of a crowd and entertain them for 5 minutes with an amazing story. Story about your life, story about your family, story about something that you know about. What's your best story? Almost everybody has something truly fantastic. But I'm not a good enough interviewer to just happen to ask the right question to elicit that story. So then I just cheat and say at the end, tell me your best story. And so sometimes that works. Sometimes people really come up with something pretty special. Another thing I really like to ask is for book recommendations because, I lost the ability to read books. When I was younger, I could see well enough to read. And then it just got a little worse. My reading got slower and slower. At a certain point, I could still see each word on the page, but it would take forever to read the whole book. I couldn't do it. So I had to give up reading books. So then thankfully, the internet became big right around that time. And I could read online. I could read lots of articles. And so I got by reading blogs and magazines and other things on the web. And then Bookshare became available. And then a few years after that, I found out about Bookshare. And of course, Bookshare is this incredible service for the blind. If people don't know, go to www.bookshare.org. It's just a fantastic service. So now, after years where I couldn't read any books, now I can read books again. So I'm always looking for great book recommendations. And what I say to people is, tell me the most entertaining book, your favorite book, the book you want to read over and over again. You don't have to tell me about a book that's going to change my life or teach me something. Of course, I'm interested in books like that too. But what I'm really interested in is just something that's just fun as hell to read. What do you have to recommend? I've gotten some great recommendations from people, and that's been a blast.
So, Randy, I'll turn this back on you. What's your best story?
I should have seen that guy. All right, I'll tell you a story. I don't know if it's my absolute best story, but it's a good story. So, and it's a good story that concerns blindness. Obviously most of my best stories don't, but this one does. So I was in China and just for business, and I was working with this company. And they always tell you for international flights you have to show up 3 hours early at the airport, which is insane, right? Who has 3 extra hours to spend at the airport? But in this case, it's China where the government's very powerful, and so you have to take the rules much more seriously. And B, the company that invited me to come over and speak in China, they didn't want me to miss my flight, right? So they're going to take me there with the full 3 hours to spare to do right by me as their guest. And I'm not going to complain because even though sitting in the airport terminal's, pretty dull or whatever, I can read books on my phone and so forth. And it beats having to do one more corporate meeting, right? So they take me there. And then, of course, just as in America, the people there can't go through security with me, but they hand me off to somebody who is going to take me through security. And I tell her, I'm like, look, once I'm seated at the gate, there's not really going to be any way for me to communicate with anybody. Blind and not speaking the language is kind of a bad combination, right? Because you kind of can't see who to talk to. And then if you can talk to them, you can't understand each other and so forth. I said, so just tell him after we go through security, but before we get to the gate, to take me by the bathroom so I can pee, right? So she says she'll tell. Okay. So we start walking. Then we're waiting, and I think we sort of stop and we're waiting. And I think, okay, we're waiting, by the elevator, but it's taking sort of a long time. And then he takes out his phone, and it becomes clear that he's opened up the translation program, right? And so then he pushes the button so that the phone will say the words in English that he's put it in Chinese. And the phone says, would you like to use the restroom? And I nod up and down because, of course, nodding is global in nature, right? And then he goes back and puts some stuff into his phone. And then the phone says to me, here we are. And that's when I realized that I'm not waiting for an elevator. I'm standing in front of a urinal doing nothing. And it just hadn't occurred to me that he would take me to the bathroom before security. Because who would ever do that, right? Of course, you have to get through security first. Even if you're super early for your flight, get through security. That is the prime directive of any traveler, right? So it just didn't even occur to me that I would have to do that anyway. So that was pretty funny. So anyway, we managed to use technology to overcome our communications barrier, and then I used the urinal, and then he took me to the gate, and so everything worked out well.
Fantastic, Randy Cohen. We are running up on the end of our time together for Mission Possible. Before we wrap things up, though, share with us again your contact information and where people can find the Dangerous Vision podcast.
Sure. Well, if you go to dangerousvision.com, you can read lots of information about technology for the blind and tips and tricks for the blind. If you go to Dangerous Vision with Randy Cohen in any podcast app, you'll find us. And if you want to email me, you can email me directly. I'm randy@hbs.edu, RANDY HBS for Harvard Business School.edu. So that's my real email address, and you can shoot me an email if there's anything I'd be helpful with.
Fantastic. Randy, thank you so much for your time today. Best of luck, and we'll talk to you soon, and hopefully we'll be tuning in for Season 3.
Really appreciate it, John. Thanks.